The airport was busy that morning. People rushed through security, wheeling their bags, looking at their phones. Some looked excited, some looked tired. Everyone was going somewhere. Among them walked a calm, confident man. He was black, tall, wearing a clean gray suit. No fancy watch, no bodyguards, just a quiet strength in his walk. His name was James Carter. He walked up to the first-class check-in desk. A lady behind the counter looked up. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only," she said quickly, without smiling. James nodded politely. "I know. I'm flying first class today." She raised an eyebrow and looked him up and down. "Do you have your ticket?" James smiled and handed her his phone. She took it, glanced at the screen, and paused. "Oh," she said. Her voice changed, but only a little. "Okay, please wait over there." She didn't offer him a drink. She didn't smile. She just motioned him to stand away from the desk like he didn't belong. James said nothing. He simply stepped aside and waited. 2 minutes later, a white man in a business suit walked up. "Good morning, sir," the same lady said brightly. "Let me get you checked in right away." James watched quietly. After check-in, James walked to the security line. There was a special lane for first-class passengers. When he stepped forward, the security guard looked confused. "Sir, this line is for premium customers." James nodded. "Yes, that's me." Still, the guard waved another officer over. They looked at James, whispered something. Then one officer said, "Random check, sir. Please step aside." They went through his bag, scanned him twice, touched his shoulders, patted his shoes. People in the line stared. One woman shook her head and said softly, "They don't do that to everyone." James stayed silent. He didn't argue. He didn't look angry, but he took out his phone. He typed a message and sent it. "I've arrived." Watching quietly. Staff at counter and security. Poor behavior. After security, James made his way to the first-class lounge. A glass door stood between him and the soft leather chairs, free snacks, and quiet music. A young man stood at the front desk. James gave a friendly nod and showed his ticket. The man looked at the screen, then at James. There was a pause. Then the man said, "Sir, are you sure this is the right lounge?" "Yes," James said calmly. "It says first class on my ticket." The young man hesitated, then called someone on the phone. He turned his back and whispered. James waited. Another passenger walked in, white, wearing sandals and a hoodie. "Welcome, Mr. Richards," the staff member said cheerfully, opening the door for him without asking for a ticket. James was still waiting. Finally, the young man hung up the phone. "All right, sir, you can go in," he said without looking at James. "No, sorry for the wait." "No, enjoy your stay." Just a quick wave of his hand. James walked in quietly, sat in the corner, watched. Inside the lounge, no one sat near him. He noticed how staff smiled at other guests, offered coffee, cleaned their tables. But no one came to him. After 20 minutes, James got up and walked to the snack table. As he poured himself a cup of tea, a staff member walked over and said, "Sir, the food here is only for lounge guests." James looked at her, surprised. "I am a lounge guest." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said quickly, realizing her mistake. But there was no real apology in her voice, just awkward silence. James returned to his seat, took out his phone again. He sent another message. "Rudeness continues. Lounge staff untrained, still observing." An hour later, it was almost time to board. James stood up and walked toward the boarding gate. He still had not raised his voice. He still wore that same calm expression. But inside, he had made a decision, a quiet one, a powerful one. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need to yell. He had something stronger: power, position, and a phone call that could change everything. As he waited near the gate, a staff member walked by and gave him a strange look. She leaned to her coworker and whispered, "He must be in the wrong place, probably trying to upgrade for free." They both laughed softly. James heard them. He said nothing. He just checked his phone one last time and typed a final message. It's worse than expected. Prepare for full review. I will handle it personally. He looked up. The plane was ready. But the story was just beginning. James Carter stepped onto the airplane. The flight attendants smiled and greeted the passengers. He walked past the rows of seats, his heart calm, but his mind alert. He could feel the looks of surprise from some of the other passengers as he made his way to the front. As he sat in his assigned first-class seat, he noticed the other passengers. They were whispering to each other, pointing at him. He smiled quietly, but deep down, he knew what they were thinking. The first incident. Soon after takeoff, a flight attendant came over to James. She looked at him and then at the empty seat next to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice polite but cold. "I'm afraid you're sitting in the wrong seat. This is a reserved area for first-class guests only." James looked up at her, his expression calm. "This is my seat," he said, pointing to his boarding pass on the tray table. The attendant paused. "Oh, I'm sorry." She quickly glanced at the ticket, but instead of apologizing further, she turned and walked away. There was no warmth, no genuine care in her voice. James sat quietly, watching her walk back to the front of the cabin. The second incident. About 20 minutes later, another flight attendant came by. She was younger, with a friendly smile. She stopped at James's row, looked at him, and hesitated. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked. James shook his head. "No, thank you." But then the flight attendant's smile faded, and she turned to a nearby passenger in business class. She said loudly, "If you need anything, feel free to ask. I'll be right there." James heard her. She had spoken louder than necessary. He noticed the other passengers glance at him again. Some looked away quickly, but others stared. He smiled to himself. He wasn't angry, but something inside him was beginning to stir. The disrespect was growing. The final straw. Halfway through the flight, James felt his seatbelt buckle loosen. He reached down to tighten it, but before he could, a third flight attendant walked over. "Sir, we need to talk," she said, her tone a bit sharp. James looked up confused. "About what?" he asked. "Well, you're sitting in first class, but there seems to be some confusion," she said, speaking quickly. "Your ticket doesn't match your seating. We need to move you to economy class." Now James stood up slowly, his calm smile never leaving his face. He spoke softly, but every word carried weight. "Are you asking me to leave my seat?" he said. The flight attendant nodded. "We'll move you to economy. Please follow me." "Why?" James asked, his voice steady. "I've been in this seat since we boarded. What's the issue now?" The flight attendant stammered. There's been a mistake. Your ticket doesn't show first class." James could see the confusion in her eyes, but he wasn't fooled. It was obvious. She thought he didn't belong. She thought he was a mistake. James looked around the cabin. Everyone was watching now. The other passengers were staring. No one spoke. The flight attendants, embarrassed, quickly turned to leave. But before they could get far, James stood up and stopped them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm, but with a strong edge. "I think you should check again." The flight attendants turned, still unsure of what to do. James smiled. "I'm the CEO of this airline." The words hung in the air, thick with surprise. The flight attendants looked at each other. The passengers, who had been whispering and staring, now fell silent. James took a deep breath. He didn't need to say anything more. His calmness, his presence said everything. A moment of realization, the flight attendants quickly checked his boarding pass again. This time, they saw something different. The truth. "Oh, Mr. Carter," one of them began, stammering. We had no idea." James nodded slowly. "I know," he said softly, "but you treated me differently because of how I look, not who I am. That's something we need to fix." The flight attendant stood frozen, unsure how to respond. James wasn't angry. He was disappointed. He had seen this before, in different places with different people. But he was never the type to shout or demand attention. Instead, he quietly made his point. The rest of the flight passed in awkward silence. James remained in his seat, looking out the window, but his mind was far from the sky. The call. As the plane began its descent, James took out his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, his mind already made up. He quickly typed a message. "This is unacceptable. Time for a full review. I will be handling this personally." He hit send. It was time to make the call that would change everything. James Carter sat back in his seat as the plane began its descent. He could feel the cold, unsettling stares of the passengers. He knew they were all thinking the same thing. Who is this man? Why did the flight attendants treat him like that? But he wasn't worried. He had seen this type of situation before. He had grown used to it. The call. As soon as the plane landed, James stood up slowly and grabbed his bag. He didn't rush, but walked with a steady pace down the aisle. The flight attendants stood awkwardly near the front, avoiding his gaze. James smiled politely as he passed them, his eyes cold with the knowledge of what he had to do. Once he was off the plane, he found a quiet corner in the terminal. He pulled out his phone, the same one he had used to send his earlier messages. He dialed the number. It rang twice before someone picked up. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end said smoothly. "How was your flight?" James didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need a full review of everything, starting with the flight attendants on my plane. I don't care what it costs." The voice paused. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right? Do you need—" "I sent a full review." James's voice was calm but sharp, cutting through the other person's words. Rudeness, disrespect, a lack of professionalism. "I don't care what kind of mistake was made, but it needs to be fixed. Now." There was a silence on the other end, then a soft response. "Understood. We will begin immediately." A history of struggle. As James waited, he thought back to how all of this started. Growing up in a rough neighborhood, he had always been told that success wasn't meant for people like him. People who looked like him. People who didn't have the right skin color or the right connections. But James had always believed something different. When he was young, he watched his mother struggle to make ends meet. He saw the way people treated her when they assumed she was less than what she was. She had no time for excuses, though. She worked harder, studied harder, and taught James that respect wasn't something you asked for. It was something you earned. James worked his way through school, through jobs, and then through businesses. He started his own companies, grew them, and became known for his quiet strength, his leadership, and his ability to connect with people. No matter where he was or who he was with, James understood one simple truth. People treated you based on how they saw you. If they saw you as small, weak, or easy to ignore, that's how they treat you. But James wasn't small. He wasn't weak, and he wasn't easy to ignore anymore. The CEO no one knew. 5 years ago, James had bought the airline. He had worked for years to save, to invest, to build his network. He had planned everything. He had never wanted to make a big public announcement, though. He didn't need to. His airline had grown quickly under his leadership, but he kept a low profile. Why show off when you could let your actions speak for you? The only time anyone ever saw James was when he was checking the staff, quietly making sure things were running smoothly. But today he had been treated like anyone else. The staff had seen only a man in a suit, without understanding who he really was. The CEO, the owner of the airline. The one who could change everything with a single call. And now, as he sat in the airport terminal, waiting for the review to begin, James knew that it wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. A full review. The next morning, James's phone buzzed with messages. He sat up in bed, his mind already focused on the task at hand. He read the first message. "Mr. Carter, we've begun reviewing the flight attendants from your flight last night. We're conducting a full investigation." He smiled slightly. It was time to make things right. He typed a quick response. "Good. Keep me updated. I want all staff trained and reminded of the standards we set." He closed his phone and leaned back. The wheels were in motion. The call that changed everything. By the time James was back at the airline's headquarters, the full review had begun. It wasn't just about the flight attendants anymore. It was about the company. It was about the culture. James sat in his office, staring out the window at the planes flying overhead. The decision had been made. 2 hours later, the HR director came into his office. She had a serious expression on her face. "Mr. Carter, the full review is complete. We've spoken with all of the flight attendants. We also looked into the training protocols and, well, we need to make a lot of changes." James nodded, listening carefully. "We'll be conducting new sensitivity training for all staff, starting next week. We'll also be revising our hiring process and ensuring every person who works here understands the values we stand for." James didn't smile, but he nodded approvingly. The decision. Later that afternoon, James called a company-wide meeting. All employees, from the lowest-ranking janitor to the CEO, were invited. He stood in front of them all, calm and composed, but with fire in his eyes. "I don't need to remind you that this company is built on respect, not just for our customers, but for each other. What happened on that plane, what happened with those flight attendants, was unacceptable. It's not just their fault. It's a failure of the system." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We will fix this. We will do better, starting today." The days after his visit to the cafe were quiet, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. The kindness he had received from the stranger in the cafe lingered in his mind. It had given him a new perspective, but he knew that the battle for respect, true respect, was far from over. The meeting back at the airline headquarters, James called an emergency meeting. It wasn't scheduled, and it wasn't planned to be a public event. But the issues he had been dealing with couldn't wait any longer. The senior executives and managers were gathered in the large conference room. They knew this was important. They knew James didn't call meetings like this without a reason. As the room settled, James stood at the front, his calm demeanor hiding the anger and disappointment he felt inside. "I'm here because I've seen something I cannot ignore," he began. His voice was steady, but the weight of his words made everyone in the room listen closely. "The way our staff treated a paying customer on one of our flights was wrong. No, it was more than wrong. It was disgraceful, and I will not stand for it." There was a tense silence in the room. Everyone was waiting for what would come next. It doesn't matter who that customer was, whether they were a regular passenger or a CEO of a major company. The way we treat people should never change based on their appearance or their status. We treat everyone with dignity. Always. James paused, letting the words sink in. The problem is not just a few flight attendants. It's a culture of assumptions, a culture that thinks someone with a different skin color or someone who doesn't look like they belong can be treated however we want. And I'm here to tell you that's over. The rising tension. One of the senior managers, a middle-aged man named Robert, stood up slowly. He had worked for the airline for over 20 years and had always been known for his strong opinions. "James, I understand what you're saying, but the staff on that flight, they were just doing their job. They were following procedures," Robert said, his voice hesitant but firm. James turned to him, his eyes cold and unwavering. "That's the problem, Robert. Following procedures without thinking about who we are serving. Procedures should never be an excuse for disrespect. If we can't treat everyone with kindness, then we have failed as a company. We have failed as human beings." Robert opened his mouth to say something but paused. He could see the determination in James's eyes. The man in front of him wasn't just the CEO. He was someone who had a vision of a better, more just world. The decision. James took a deep breath and continued. "We are making changes. Immediate changes. This company is built on trust and respect, and if we cannot live up to that, we won't survive. We're going to retrain all of our employees, starting from the top. We'll work with diversity experts. We'll bring in new voices, and we'll listen to the people who we failed. We will get better, or we will fail." There was another silence, but this time it was different. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't defensive. It was a silence of understanding. Everyone in that room knew that James was right. James looked around at all of them, his eyes intense, but filled with a deep sadness. "You will all be required to attend these sessions, no exceptions. This isn't just about fixing a mistake. It's about preventing it from ever happening again." The room shifted. People started to murmur quietly, but James didn't let them distract him. "This is the way forward," he said quietly. "But make no mistake. If I ever see another situation like what happened on that flight, if I ever hear of our company disrespecting a customer because of their race or their appearance, there will be consequences. I will not allow it." The moment of truth. The meeting was over, but James didn't leave right away. He stood at the front of the room, watching as his executives filed out, deep in conversation. Robert was one of the last to leave. He walked slowly toward James, his face unreadable. I get what you're saying, James," Robert said, his voice softer than it had been before. "I wasn't always in agreement with the way you handled things, but I see now how important this is." James nodded. "I appreciate that, Robert. But I need everyone to understand this. It's not about agreeing with me. It's about doing what's right. We have a responsibility, not just as a company, but as people." Robert paused for a moment, then extended his hand. "I'll do my part. We'll all do our part." James shook his hand firmly. "Thank you." A quiet victory. As James left the meeting, he felt a strange sense of peace. The battle wasn't over, but this was a victory. A small one, but it was the first step towards something bigger. He didn't know how long it would take to change the culture within the company, but he was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about an incident on a plane. This was about changing how people saw each other, how they treated each other, and he was willing to fight for that. A call for change. The next day, James made another call. This time, it was to his team at the head office. He informed them about the new initiatives, about the retraining, and about the new values he wanted to instill in every employee. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't asking for anyone to be thankful. He was simply making sure that this company, under his leadership, would never lose its humanity again. After the intense meeting, things began to change at the airline. James Carter could feel the atmosphere shifting. The company was no longer just about profit or efficiency. It was about something deeper, something far more important: respect. The first steps. In the weeks that followed, the training sessions began. Employees from all departments were gathered for workshops on diversity, inclusion, and empathy. It wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding the why behind the rules. James made sure to be involved in every part of the process. He didn't want to just be a leader from the top down. He wanted to be a part of the change, to lead by example. He attended training sessions, spoke with employees, and made it clear that this was personal to him. He had seen firsthand how easy it was for people to overlook the humanity of others, how easy it was for a person to be judged based on their appearance or their background, and he wasn't going to let that happen in his company anymore. The resistance. But not everyone was on board with the changes. Robert, the senior manager who had stood up to him during the meeting, wasn't the only one who had doubts. There were whispers among some of the older employees, those who had been with the company for years. They didn't understand why these changes were necessary. One afternoon, as James walked through the office, he overheard a conversation between two employees. "I just don't get it," one of them said, his voice low. "I've been doing this job for over 15 years. Now suddenly, I'm supposed to treat people differently just because of their skin color or their background. What happened to just doing my job?" The other employee shrugged. "I don't know, man, but I guess we have to do what they say. It's a new direction." James paused for a moment, taking in the words. He could feel the tension, the pushback against the changes. It was always hard to change the way people thought, especially when those thoughts were so deeply ingrained. A personal encounter. That evening after work, James went to the same cafe where he had met the kind stranger. He wasn't looking for answers, but he needed a place to think. He ordered his coffee and sat down at a quiet corner table. As he sipped his drink, he felt the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The work ahead of him was far from easy. He had made the decision to change the company's culture, but now, he had to see it through. And it wasn't just about policies or training. It was about changing hearts. As he sat there, lost in thought, the door to the cafe opened, and to his surprise, the same woman from that day walked in. She spotted him and smiled, the same warm, genuine smile he remembered. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice as kind as before. James smiled, feeling a moment of relief. Not at all. A new perspective. They talked for hours. This time, the conversation was different. James told her about the changes he was making in his company, the struggles he was facing, and the resistance he was encountering. He spoke about his desire to create a culture of respect, but also about the difficulty of changing old habits. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," James admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm pushing against a wall that's too strong to break." The woman listened carefully, her eyes full of understanding. "Change is never easy," she said softly. "But you've already taken the hardest step. You've acknowledged the problem. And now you're doing something about it." James sighed, his shoulders heavy. "I just wish more people understood that. It's not about making things difficult. It's about doing the right thing." She smiled again, her eyes gentle. "You can't control what other people think, James, but you can control what you do. And the more you lead by example, the more others will follow. It takes time, but you'll get there." Weeks passed, and the changes James had fought so hard for began to take root. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but things were different. The atmosphere at the airline had shifted. Employees were starting to take the lessons from the diversity training seriously. They were beginning to see each other, not just as colleagues or customers, but as people. James stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city. It was a clear day, and the sunlight was soft, casting long shadows across the streets below. He had come a long way from the moment when everything had seemed so impossible. There were still challenges ahead, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. A company transformed. James had always known that change was hard, but he hadn't realized just how deeply ingrained old habits could be. Yet, as time went on, he saw the transformation in his company. It wasn't just the training sessions or the policies that were changing, it was the culture. The flight attendants, who once might have judged a customer based on their appearance, were now more aware, more thoughtful. They treated everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter their background or status. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In the halls of the office, employees started to engage with one another in ways that felt more genuine. The whispers and the resistance that had once filled the air had quieted down. People were listening to one another. They were starting to see the value in being kind, in being fair. A meeting of hearts. One morning, James was scheduled to meet with the airline's board of directors. It wasn't just a routine meeting, it was a critical one. The board had been hesitant about some of the changes James had pushed for, questioning whether they would be worth the cost. Today, James was determined to show them just how valuable those changes were. The meeting started with a review of the company's performance. Numbers were up. Customer satisfaction was higher than it had been in years. But what mattered most to James was the shift he saw in the attitudes of his employees. "Look at what we've achieved," James said, his voice steady but passionate. "We've made strides in diversity and inclusion. We've shown that when we treat people with respect, when we make them feel valued, they respond. Our customers are happier. Our staff is more engaged. This is the future of this company." He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, some skeptical, others thoughtful. "We're not just a company," he continued. "We are a community. And when we build that community on respect, on kindness, we don't just gain customers, we gain trust." There was a long silence after James spoke. The board members exchanged looks, and for a moment, no one said anything. Then Robert, the senior manager who had once disagreed with James, spoke up. "You're right," Robert said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I've seen it myself. The changes you've made, they're working. We're not just another airline. We're a company that cares. And that matters." James nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The board had seen the value of his vision. They understood that the company's success didn't come just from profits or efficiency. It came from building a culture of respect and empathy. The ripple effect. As the meeting ended, James left the room with a sense of accomplishment. He had made his case, and he had won their support. But the victory wasn't just his. It was shared by everyone in the company. The employees who had worked tirelessly to embrace the changes, the customers who now felt valued, and the passengers who flew with the airline knowing they were treated with respect. James realized that this was just the beginning. The road to redemption had been long and difficult, but it had led into a place where he could see real change. And that change, though it started in the airline, would continue to ripple out into the world.